Hi there. Hey, Steve Hopkins here with Jordan River Group, and I wanted to just have a short conversation about something that's just near and dear to my heart right now, as we have been working so hard digging into inclusion work. And whether you're at the first stage and really focused on inclusion as a separate entity, which I find to be very exciting but very, very challenging work, you could also be somebody that's carrying inclusion forward in the other stages of growth and contribution and challenging the status quo, working on innovation. Whatever the place that you find yourself right now, I just wanted to share a couple thoughts about an important topic having to deal with this, and something we can be thoughtful about and we're probably going to encounter as we lean into this work. And that's this idea of being passively complicit. And I don't know about you, but when I started working on this concept a while ago, I wasn't even totally clear on what complicit meant. And once I really dug into it, I was like, oh my gosh, this idea of choosing to be involved or participate in bad things, something illegal or questionable, right? That's the definition of it. And in the work we're talking about being passively complicit in exclusion behaviors, right? Meaning we become a passive bystander to watching and observing the very things we're trying to work against, right? So instead of doing something, we're quiet and we see it happening and we don't do anything, right? This is a very classic, well-researched phenomenon that's baked in called the bystander effect, right? And just that idea of not being willing to get involved, jumping in. There's all kinds of studies and scenarios, helping out somebody in need in a dark alley, or all these city scenes or accidents that happen, whatever. And we learn that we are keen to take our cues from the society around us, all the other people. It kind of distributes the responsibility for action. There's 3 or 4 people. I don't need to do everything. This is a very well-researched thing in first aid, for instance, right? And who steps forward and does something, who acts, or does everybody kind of watch and wait for somebody to act? And so there's a lot of mechanisms at work here. There's certainly apathy, not caring, it's not my thing, so that can be it. But I think there's 2 more interesting phenomenons that are in play here when we're talking about observing exclusionary behaviors and us being passive and not going into action with any kind of verbalization or support of the offended person. And I think one of them is fear. So this idea that in the very moment that we're observing somebody else be vulnerable and trying to be courageous, and then paying a penalty for that with an exclusionary response, we find ourselves fearful and unwilling to be courageous in a vulnerable moment as well. And of course, we know this is difficult. I'm certainly not describing something that should be easy, but it should challenge us to decide who we want to be in those moments. And, we're thinking about being labeled as a troublemaker. We're thinking about maybe some retribution coming to us, in fact, right? And so fear clearly can be in play here. And just being aware of that being one of the triggers, one of the motivations, I think is really, really valuable. I think the other one is just being caught unaware, right? And that's why we like to spend so much time talking about exclusion and inclusion and the desire and the comfort and playing around with the concept of creating a sense of belonging so that we're aware. We don't get caught off guard, and we understand what cycles are in play when somebody is nudged to reveal who they are as an individual and plays a vulnerable step and takes a courageous step. The cycle demands that we really watch what happens next. That's the critical thing, right? And that's the very time often leaders turn away and get distracted and do something else. So we recognize somebody did something, but we don't watch for the outcome. And if there was an exclusionary action that followed, a penalty to that vulnerability, we hear about it a week later, as opposed to being there in the moment, realizing, I know what comes next, let me see what happens. So we get caught off guard with the results of that, but we could even be caught off guard in the moment because we haven't spent any time thinking about this. What if somebody's uncomfortable? What if the person who's the offender is actually my boss? I mean, what are my tools in my toolbox to go into motion in this time? So, and I think the last thing before we go into some tactical things to kind of flex that muscle and practice this is just the understanding that we sometimes will spend so much time thinking, hey, the solution here is to get rid of the offender. And if actually casting out the offender is the appropriate action for a certain action, if there's been passive complicity at all, then that's still going to remain. The memory of that, and probably the behavior of the people that were passively complicit, will still be baked in there as part of the culture. So we could expect that same thing to happen because the players are the same. It's just the offender will be different. So it's worth noting that we still have work to do here, even if we put a target on somebody's back and say, you did wrong, out you go. If we know that people have been passive, people have been a passive bystander to those things happening, we can expect that cycle to continue. So let's talk for just a quick minute as we wrap up here about what we can do, both as a participant and what we can do also as a leader in supporting the culture and the growth of the culture. And I think one of these things, a lot of this is just communicating with our team member, but one of them is reinforcing that people should rely on their own instincts. So the very thing that, remember, the bystander effect kind of begs for us to do, which is to take all of our social cues from around us. We want to encourage and practice and model ourselves to rely on our own instincts. That thing that you feel in your gut right now is right. So we have to act on it, right? As opposed to looking around and following the lead of passive participants, if you will, right? So discovering that, encouraging that, even just having conversations about that can be really valuable. I think the other thing is celebrating and rewarding the very people you've chosen to be on the team, and in the aspects and the DNA qualities of things like already knowing they have a concern for others. It's one of the qualities they brought to the table, or a high moral value standard, right? And just calling that out and saying, hey, this is when that comes into play. And we want to see it in action. I want mine in action, and I'll look for yours as well. It's okay. That's the right play. What you feel you bring to the table, we can use in these moments, right? And that's exactly right. I think it goes along with, knowing there's a high value on feelings of social responsibility. That, yes, we're individuals and we do have concerns and fears about actions we might take, but we're part of this team. You're part of the social makeup of this team, and the good and the bad of who we are as a group, especially when bad things happen. Who are we in those moments as a team? And the feelings of social responsibility we want to reward, that we as individuals get called into action to act and speak on behalf of the group and the way we want to behave in those moments. So all these things are just great things to think about, and don't pass by them too quickly. I know it's a challenge for me as well. There's opportunities. This is kind of one of those psychological tool buckets that we can make sure to communicate to our teams and say, hey, you have the tools necessary to act in this way, and I want to encourage you to use them. And what happened a couple weeks ago is not indicative of how we want our culture to represent. So let's be more vigilant. And I want to encourage you to act, and you'll be able to see me to act as well. And that's really my last point. As leaders, we must model this stuff. And I know in my experience going into teams that are fractured and teams that are hurting and teams that are underperforming, one of the things I see in a common way is leaders themselves that are passive bystanders. They aspire for their team members to act and behave in a certain way, and when they have the moment to speak and act, they're quiet. And so that's the challenge. Model this in its fullest, look for it in others, and reward and recognize it. And I think we'll have a faster, a smoother, more rewarding trajectory into building a culture that we all aspire to, and the one that you can say, I belong here, and you can experience that voice from the rest of your team that says, this is where I want to be, I feel safe here, I belong here as well. Thanks for listening. Hopefully this is helpful, and we'll see you on the next lesson.